We had another conversation.
And now you know all about your picture.
Yeah, but I was going to say, I couldn't unlock my brain because I was so interested in writing papers and all the other things I had on the No, now I'm doing something totally different. I'm like, man, help me think perfectly. She really helped me. But they may take me back out. But she's great. And that was a great conversation. Yeah,
based on the phone on the Litvak your journal, give me a copy. If somebody's interested, or even on some rabbit hole. I'm here. Oh, Bob's legal. That's what we're talking about. And Bob is the director of
Now, do your speakers typically stand at the...
Either.
Either?
Whatever you're more comfortable.
You're welcome to deliver from here and take questions from there, or just do it from here.
If they can see me, I might do it from here because I'm short and I'll sort of...
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Robert Litvak, Director of International Studies at the Woodrow Wilson Center, and I'd like to welcome you to today's meeting with Professor Martha Crenshaw on New versus Old Terrorism. Today's meeting is the 10th in the series on terrorism and homeland security, co-sponsored by the Woodrow Wilson Center, the Rand Corporation, and the U.S. Army's Eisenhower National Security Series. Within the Woodrow Wilson Center, this meeting is co-sponsored with the Middle East program directed by Haleh Esfandiari. The Wilson Center is delighted to be partnering with Rand and the U.S. Army in the organization of this series. I'd like to thank and will welcome to the podium in a moment my co-chair of this series, Bruce Hoffman, who has been instrumental in conceiving this series and bringing it to fruition. I'd also like to thank the U.S. Army for funding this series, and in particular the Army Chief of Staff, General Peter Schumacher. And since no other Army people are around, I can actually thank Jim Craig as well, who's a major who runs this program, who generally likes to stay out of the limelight, but he's a prime mover in this whole initiative. For those of you not familiar with the U.S. Army's Eisenhower National Security Series, it's a full year of activities on topical international security issues that culminate in their annual conference. This year's Eisenhower National Security Conference will be held here in Washington, in fact, in this building, the Ronald Reagan building, on September 27th and 28th. As I mentioned, this is the 10th meeting in this series, which is the inaugural year of this series. I'm delighted there's going to be, to announce that there will be a year two picking up in the autumn. We will have one more meeting in this first year's group of meetings in June, and an invitation will be sent out about that. The purpose of the meetings is to provide a forum in which experts from government, business, journalism, and academia can meet on a regular basis to hear presentations by preeminent international and national experts on topical issues, and to exchange views and information. The founder of the Woodrow Wilson Center, the late Senator Daniel Patrick Moynihan, remarked that how you think about the world affects how you act in the world. And I usually at this point just immediately pass off to Bruce to tee up the topic of the day and to introduce the speaker in greater detail. But in the case of Martha Crenshaw, we are welcoming her back to the Woodrow Wilson Center, not to this building, but because she participated in a major international conference we sponsored in the 1980s that Walter Reich, a senior scholar at the center, organized, and that became one of the center's best-selling books, entitled The Origins of Terrorism. Martha contributed an excellent chapter to that, and I think the opening paragraph of her chapter from that book reflects the objectives of this series that we're trying to pursue. She wrote that, referring to the conference, that the volume, the papers from which the conference papers that became the book. She wrote, a State Department official remarked that once the action starts, officials cease to worry about the why of terrorism, and, lacking the leisure for theory, revert to intuitive guidelines. The problem with this dismissal of the practical uses of theory is that the policymaker's intuition depends on implicit sets of values and assumptions about the causes and processes of terrorism. Information about terrorism, however fragmentary, is routinely interpreted and converted into usable form by intelligence analysts and the government's demand for relevant information. And the government's demand for relevant information peaks during crises. Furthermore, the State Department admits paradoxically that expertise on terrorism is called into play only during the management of crises. In other words, officials may deny that theory is relevant, but they rely on it constantly, and at no time more than during a crisis when they think they have escaped its influence. Well, today Martha Crenshaw will talk about new versus old terrorism. Maybe what she referred to in terms of the state, or that State Department official referred to in terms of expertise being just drawn in during a crisis may have changed in the new era. But one point that I think still holds true is that how we think about the world affects how we act in the world. And the purpose of this series is to look at new concepts and methods to try to develop, increase the pool of intellectual capital on the terrorism field. No one better to co-chair this series and to introduce a speaker than Bruce Hoffman, who's one of this country's leading experts on terrorism. Bruce?
Thanks, Rob. Several times this past year I've said that I was very pleased to introduce someone who needed no introduction, but I don't think that statement could be more true or more accurate than in Professor Martha Crenshaw's case, and I think that's emblematic by the fact that this event of the entire year has drawn the highest number of RSVPs, so Martha's reputation certainly is well known in Washington. Martha has actually literally been at work on this subject for decades. She wrote her doctoral dissertation on the FLN's struggle against French colonial rule in Algeria in the 1950s, and then really magisterially began to apply that corpus of knowledge to contemporary terrorism issues. I think Martha is very well credited with having created really the study of terrorism as an organizational phenomena and coined perhaps one of the most insightful and important means of studying terrorism because of its instrumentality as determining its actions. She's been at Wesleyan University and has held a chair in government for many years. She's the editor of Terrorism and Legitimacy and more recently of Terrorism in Context. She's the recent recipient of a Guggenheim Award, I believe. Is that correct? And I think most importantly, in addition to really being the doyen of terrorism studies in the United States, perhaps in the world, she's been a mentor and a teacher and advisor to countless generations of terrorism scholars that have benefited and profited from her wisdom and indeed her guidance. And I have to say, at a time when terrorism studies has become a bit ragged around the edges, where sometimes there's febrile meetings and heated debates and discussions, Martha has always been a model of concision, precision, and indeed collegiality. And it's really an enormous pleasure to welcome you here today. So thank you for coming.
Thank you. Thank you, Bruce. Well, thank you for a very kind introduction. Can you all hear me? It's really very flattering. And I have a confession to make before I start my talk. I was amused that Rob quoted something I said about an anonymous State Department official at a conference some years ago. I think that sufficient time has elapsed. I can tell you who that official was. It was one L. Paul Bremer, now known to all of you, who at that time was a coordinator of counterterrorism at the State Department and was at the conference at the Wilson Center and said those things that I quoted without identifying him at the beginning of my article. So that identifies the State Department official. What I want to talk about today presents actually something of a contrarian view. I hope Bruce will still regard me as being collegial because it's going to present something of a critical view of the idea of a new terrorism. I'm sure all of you know that the idea that there is a new terrorism, and called by that name, has been growing since about 1993 in the aftermath of the First World Trade Center bombing. There was an article in Newsweek magazine called The New Terrorism, and that's one of the first instances of the use of that term in the popular media, and since then it's become the title of books and articles and a long list of subjects. If you've read the 911 Commission report, and I assume that most of you have, you will recall that the commissioners thought that our not having recognized the new terrorism was one reason for our not seeing that 9/11 was looming on the horizon. Other people have made this argument as well. And many analysts of terrorism and analysts in the post-9/11 period have argued that the knowledge that we had acquired of the old terrorism had become outmoded, obsolete, anachronistic, irrelevant, that we needed a new paradigm, a new framework of understanding of terrorism. So, as I said, I just want to raise some critical questions. I want to present something of a skeptical view, something perhaps even of a contrarian view. And I don't want to deny that terrorism has not changed over time. It certainly has changed. But I want to argue that perhaps this is not a difference of kind, but a difference of degree, and that there's not a fundamentally different phenomenon confronting us out there, but something that is a result of a historical evolution, a result of gradual change over time, and changes that are a result of a number of forces that have actually changed a number of ways of doing politics in the modern world, not just terrorism, that terrorism has changed along with other violent and nonviolent political phenomena. So I want to ask the question of whether or not the argument that there is a new terrorism is based first on a sufficient understanding of the past, of what we might call the old terrorism, and second, correct understanding or interpretation of what we're confronting now, of both the past and the present. And I want to ask whether it really is a good idea to throw out what we knew before about the old terrorism. And I think I'm going to conclude that it would be dangerous to do so. So what I want to argue is that there are two things that need to be done in order to clarify a concept of a new terrorism. And I don't think that they've been done sufficiently thoroughly yet. I think some of it's been done, but not all. First, we need a very clear specification of the concept of what is new, what is the new terrorism, what are the attributes, the characteristics of the new terrorism, what features must such terrorism show in order to be called a new terrorism. And these attributes have to be very carefully defined, and the relationship among these attributes really should be defined in theoretical terms. And thus, we need to know what are the attributes of the new, what are the attributes of the old, and obviously there has to be a distinction between the two that has to be clear and persuasive to us. The second set of questions that we have to answer pertains to the applicability of such a concept. If we can then say, here's the new, here's the old, then which groups, which practices, which phenomena do these concepts apply to? These would be conceptual buckets or categories or data containers. So which groups would we put where? Which behaviors would we put where? So we've got to explain applicability. Now, if you read the literature on the new terrorism, just as a start, the groups that are called the new terrorists would include the 1993 plotters, Ramzi Youssef, and the sort of 1993, 1995 plotters, and it would include Al-Qaeda and its various affiliates and offshoots and component parts, although here it's not entirely clear which of the local groups that have allied themselves with Al-Qaeda or appear to have received assistance from or be inspired by Al-Qaeda would be considered as part of the new terrorism, because it's just not always clearly specified. Also in this category are usually included the various groups associated with the Christian identity movement and the Aryan nations, including Timothy McVeigh, the Oklahoma City bombers, Jewish extremists, the groups who tried to blow up the Dome of the Rock and were implicated in the assassination of Yitzhak Rabin, and Aum Shinrikyo, the group, the Japanese religious cult that was responsible for the Tokyo subway attack as well as other incidents. Now, Hezbollah is sometimes placed in this category of the new terrorists, but sometimes not. So it has sort of a problematic status. But this generally is our universe of groups that most people agree belong in this category. So I want to talk about three things. One, the goals that would be behind terrorism. Two, the methods that such groups would use. And third, organization, structure, resources, the organizational side of it. And what I want to do is first lay out the two competing paradigms, the new versus the old, and then talk about their applicability. How do they fit? does the description of the old really fit what we know about the old? Does the description of the new really fit what we know about the new? And what kind of questions are raised by this kind of examination of what it means to talk about a new terrorism? If you take first the idea of goals or objectives or aims behind terrorism, the new terrorism argument or paradigm, although I sort of don't like to use the term paradigm, we could perhaps use model or framework or explanation or interpretation, assumes uniformly that religion is the main aim behind terrorism of this type. But sometimes the notion that it's religious is qualified somewhat, although it's not always entirely clear, by talking about millenarianism and apocalyptic sorts of beliefs and views associated with religion. And let me say in passing, those two need not necessarily go together. Other characteristics, again, drawing on the literature, would be an amorphousness or ambiguity of the goals. It's not clear exactly what these people want. Often they're described as fanatics, so fanaticism is one of their objectives. They are also described as having global or transnational or systemic level ambitions, and most often they're characterized as seeking destruction for its own sake. Therefore, in this kind of model or interpretive framework, the means shade off into the ends, and we'll come to that in a moment. So they're religious, they aim at killing lots of people, and beyond that there's not much. As Dan Benjamin and Steve Simon said, they don't want to sit at the table, they want to destroy the table. And they also tend to be incomprehensible. It's hard to understand any rational logic to their goals. By contrast, the old terrorists are thought to be limited in their aims, more specific, more local in their orientation, more tangible, usually associated with territory and nationalism, national autonomy, separatism, independence movements, thus understandable, comprehensible to us, what they want. Also more prone to or amenable to compromise. Because their goals are limited and they're rational, they're more likely to compromise. They tend to be more realistic and more pragmatic. So this is a contrast between the new and the old, again drawing on writings on the subject of the new versus the old terrorism. Okay, so if we have this model and this distinction between the two types, how well does it fit? How well does our model fit the groups that are supposed to be the new terrorists and then all the others who presumably are the old terrorists? Well, if we take the new terrorists first, again we have something of a group of groups that don't always fit together very well. The religion behind Aum Shinrikyo, the religion behind Al-Qaeda, the religion behind Hezbollah are really quite different sets of beliefs and doctrines. There's also a dispute among people who are specialists on the Middle East and specialists on Al-Qaeda as to whether the aims of Al-Qaeda really are global, really are to create a world-level caliphate, or whether they really are indeed local aims, that they aim at overthrowing regimes in Egypt, Saudi Arabia in particular, and now possibly even Iraq. So there's debate. It's not universally accepted among people who are specialists that these are the aims even of Al-Qaeda. And of course we note that there are other groups whose goals would fit this model of the new terrorism but who don't otherwise fit very well, and one of those would be Hezbollah al-Tahrir, whose ideology and objectives are not dissimilar from some of these other groups, but it's not included in the group of the new terrorists. So again, there are questions raised there, and I think they have to be dealt with before we can say that these groups fit neatly into a category of groups whose aims are religious, unlimited, transnational, global, they don't compromise, and there's no rationale really that the rest of us can perceive. What about the old paradigm, the old terrorism paradigm or model, and how it applies to all those other groups who presumably are the old terrorists? Well, of course, the first group or set of groups that would come to most people's minds who study the history of terrorism would be the anarchist movement, precisely in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, which had wanted to overturn all government. That was seems to be a pretty unlimited sort of objective. If you look at some of the left-wing European groups of the 1970s and 1980s, and you look, for example, at the Red Army faction in West Germany, a really rather bizarre group that saw itself not just as bringing about the revolution in Germany, but as overthrowing American imperialism throughout the world. And they identified very strongly with Third World revolutionaries. They saw the Third World as sort of being the heart of the struggle, themselves being in the second tier. They saw Germany as a colony of the United States within NATO, and they thought if they could drive the U.S. out of Germany, that would help crumble American rule in the Third World and destroy, in the end, American domination. This is not very realistic. And the West German government didn't think that it was really quite possible to compromise with them. Their goals weren't very territorial, so it's sort of hard to see that that fits. If we look at Sendero Luminoso in Peru, again, a group with a very odd ideology. They wanted to create a Maoist regime, not just a communist regime or a socialist regime, but a Maoist, a particular type of Maoism in Peru. Again, the government certainly saw them as being enormously intransigent. If we look at Black September, we look at the Abu Nidal organization. These were certainly not governments that the Israeli government thought had limited objectives that they could compromise with. So again, these are questions we would have to raise as to whether the old terrorists really were so realistic and so pragmatic, so limited, so local in their objectives. Again, this is something that would have to be, it has to be demonstrated. We can't simply assume that this was the case. Also, if we, some observations or questions raised by this type of comparison, even the groups that espouse religion often are nationalistic as well. So you actually usually have mixes of doctrines and mixes of goals in reality among these different groups. It's not so clean as to say, okay, here are these groups, their goals are religious and millenarian. Here's this group, their aims are very local, they're nationalistic, they're territorial, and they're pragmatic. Perhaps what we should look at in light of the fact that we have some rather odd bedfellows here, both across groups and within groups, would be the structures of their beliefs, the psychological structures of beliefs as opposed to the content of those beliefs, whether it's religion, whether it is secular. Also, I think that there is a certain danger in relegating a set of movements, organizations, and groups to a category in which one assumes from the start that there can be no compromise, no negotiation, no bargaining. I'm sure that some of you read Saadetdin Ibrahim's editorial in the Saturday New York Times. I think that he's a fellow here at the Wilson Center at this moment, and he wrote a very long and persuasive editorial saying that even among the Islamist groups, particularly in Egypt, the groups that he knows, and in the wider Middle East, that there is a possibility of bringing these groups into the political process. So I think that it's perhaps very dangerous to exclude groups from the beginning and saying that you assume that they can never be part of the political process. That it would be best to raise that as a question and to try to not to assume that they are in effect beyond the pale. Now moving on to the question of means. And here I've already pointed out that from a new terrorism point of view, there is a causal relationship between the objectives and the methods of the new terrorism. The objective of the new terrorism is to kill as many people as possible, destruction for its own sake, to bring down the table, and therefore the means that they're willing to use are unlimited. They simply want to kill a lot of people. They don't have any larger purpose beyond that. Therefore, they tend to be highly indiscriminate in their use of violence. The more casualties, the better. It's an extremely blunt instrument. And of course, they're also assumed to be particularly attracted to the use of weapons of mass destruction as a form of catastrophic terrorism. They want to be catastrophic. The best way to be catastrophic, presumably, is with such weapons, and therefore they are strongly drawn to these weapons. The old terrorists, by way of contrast, are assumed to be limited in their methods, just as they're limited in their goals. They are restrained, they are selective, they are specific. And for them, terrorism is a refined instrument precisely because they want to sit at the table and bargain. They want to compromise. They want to be brought into the political process, and therefore they don't want to go too far. Brian Jenkins is very famous for having said that terrorists want a lot of people watching, not a lot of people dead. He's probably sorry he said this. At this point, it's been quoted so often, but that does epitomize that view of the old terrorism. They're using terrorism for political influence. This is their ultimate goal, therefore they're not going to go too far. The new terrorists have no such inhibitions. The more dead, the better. Now, applicability. Here, probably the new terrorism framework fits best, but I would argue to you that that's precisely because it was on this variable that the cases were selected. And to select your cases on the basis of this one attribute and then find others is perhaps not the best way of going about building a model. The patterns, however, are not entirely systematic. Of course, as we all know, at least I would suggest that a preoccupation with the likelihood that terrorists would seek to acquire or would acquire weapons of mass destruction, particularly that some states might give them weapons of mass destruction, may have obscured for us a little bit the fact that they could be very catastrophic without using weapons of mass destruction, which we now know and which a number of people who work on terrorism had said well before 9/11, that there is a distinction to be made between using such weapons and killing a lot of people. You can still kill a lot of people without using such weapons, and those might be two separate ambitions on the part of underground movements. But still, the two did get, in effect, merged together, and I think might have created misleading. Now, the use of weapons of mass destruction is, of course, still extremely rare. So there's not a systematic pattern whereby the new terrorists are seeking and using these particular types of methods. Maybe a variety of reasons why not, but here's the case in terms of the data we have to demonstrate this point. And we actually don't have that many incidents of their having killed a much, much larger number than the old terrorists. There's some incidents, but we don't have a lot of incidents to deal with in order to make this point. And some of the groups, of course, that were active, that could be said to fall into this category, are no longer active in the very much in the field of violence. They might, of course, reemerge. We don't ever want to neglect that possibility. So the fit here, again, I think it needs to be improved. What about the fit of the paradigm of the old with representatives of the old? Well, here I would argue that the old terrorists weren't always necessarily so restrained, and that the question of restraint is actually something that varies among the groups that fall in the old terrorism category. Some were more restrained than others. Some really did seem to aim at, in effect, indiscriminate numbers of civilian casualties, and the anarchists were among those. By the standards of the time, when technology was much less advanced, a factor that we always want to keep in the backs of our minds, they certainly threw bombs into cafes, into parliaments, into theaters, into crowded places. I look back and I think of the FLN in Algeria. As Bruce noted, I wrote a book on that. We're all now interested again in the FLN in Algeria. You think of the Battle of Algiers, bombs in cafes. It was indiscriminate, again, not on the scale of 9/11, but certainly we would not say that it was highly selective. And also thinking about the Algerian War caused me to think about the Secret Army Organization. I don't know whether very many people are familiar with the Secret Army Organization anymore. The famous OAS emerged at the end of the Algerian War in protest against the French decision to grant Algerian independence, which they saw for certain was coming. There had been negotiations for a couple of years, and they didn't want it. So here you had a group composed of former military, French military and other foreign legion, and also representatives of the European settler community who resented the prospective loss of their privileges in an independent Algeria. They started with selective terrorism, but when they realized that time was speeding by and they were not getting anywhere, they moved to highly indiscriminate terrorism, just bombing indiscriminately in the Muslim quarters of Algiers, for example, simply to kill as many Arabs, as many Muslims as possible. And after that, they didn't really care what happened as long as they killed a lot of them. And it actually made me think of the situation in Iraq now, not to claim that there's a direct comparison between the two, the OAS on the one hand and the Sunni minority in Iraq, but we should look at groups that are using terrorism in order to defend a privileged position that they now see in danger and being taken away from them, as opposed to groups that are using terrorism in order to bring about change, whether it be religious or revolutionary. These groups can be enormously dangerous, and the OAS, had it had more means at its disposal, would have been much more dangerous. They burned down the library of the University of Algiers. They rolled a car bomb into a crowd of Algerian workers waiting for day work on the dock. And in their documents, they said they didn't care how many they killed. They would have killed more if they could have. They drove by and just shot at any Muslim waiting at a bus stop. It was just that blind and indiscriminate. Also looking at this and looking at who was likely to be indiscriminate, I noticed, having just reading the small little bits of pieces of news in the New York Times, that the trial in Canada of people who were accused of being responsible for the bombing of Air India 182 in 1985 were released because the case against them fell through. They couldn't make the case against them, so they were released. But 329 people were killed on that airliner, and my recollection is that there was another attempt that failed at about the same time, and they found the bombs on the luggage carousel. Bruce may remember. That also made me think of another problem in our trying to estimate the level of discrimination, the destructiveness of different groups, and that's, of course, failed attempts. Now, we have what we know happened and how many people were killed. We don't know, or I don't know, some people may know some of this, I doubt they know all of it, how many attempts to kill a large number of people actually then failed. Or, conversely, how many bombings that weren't meant to kill so many people actually killed a lot of people. So it's very difficult, I would argue, to ascertain how this particular attribute fits when you look at reality, that within the category of the old terrorists, there's enormous variability in the willingness and the ability of groups to cause large numbers of civilian casualties. Again, we could look at it as a matter of scale, the difference between hundreds and thousands. But again, technology as an underlying condition that makes it easier for anybody, I wouldn't bank on the fact that the old terrorists, quote unquote, are really entirely always self-restrained. Makes me think that maybe we need to look at some other reasons for mass killings or the absence of mass killings. And what if we looked at terrorism and looked at other motives for mass killings? Even going all the way up to genocide, looking at communal and sectarian violence and saying what leads some groups to wish to destroy large numbers of the enemy, including civilians, women, children, non-combatants. And that might be the way to approach it, and to leave open the question and to say that sometimes there are sources of restraint or lack of restraint in these movements do not have to do with doctrine, and to accept that there may not be a causal relationship between a religious objective and a desire to cause large numbers of casualties. Now, the third variable that I promised that I would talk about is organization and structure of these groups. Again, the new versus the old. Well, the new terrorism is said to be now a network that is networked in terms of its organization. It is decentralized. It proceeds often largely by inspiration. Very small groups are simply inspired by the actions, by the doctrines, by the calls to arms of other groups, of their leaders, of their usually religious leaders. And often they include people who are amateurs, who are new to the game, who don't have a lot of training or experience. They tend to follow the form of leaderless resistance, popularized by the American right-wing extremist movement, and typically they are independent of state sponsors. Now again, I have taken these attributes from all the different works in this category and put them together into these models, and I probably present it much more starkly than other people would, but I'm doing it for purposes of comparison and to lay out the structure of the models to you more clearly. The old terrorism, by contrast, is thought of as being highly centralized, hierarchical, chain of command, top to bottom. Usually your classic cellular structure that grew up in the 19th century as a way to organize yourselves and maintain secrecy and security tends to have people in it who've done this for a long time, who are, if not professional revolutionaries, people who've long been in the underground, who know what they're doing. And the old terrorism is said by some people to have been almost exclusively state-sponsored rather than independent of states. And again, different authors put a different emphasis on these different attributes. I have now merged them together. So, does this fit, this distinction between the old and the new and the old? Well, look first at the groups of new terrorists. Certainly Al-Qaeda is the group that's most often represented as being organized as a network, and there's been a lot of work on this. But Aum Shinrikyo, I don't think that it was a network. I see it as being much more hierarchical and dependent on a really important single charismatic leader, as was, for example, Sendero Luminoso in Peru. Also, I would argue that there's a big difference in Al-Qaeda pre and post 9/11. That there was much more centralization in Al-Qaeda before its bases in Afghanistan were broken up, before it was put on the run around the world. And I would also argue that Al-Qaeda was aided by states, or at least by a group in control of some territory, and that would be the Taliban, was also aided by the Sudan in earlier years. And it's hard to imagine Al-Qaeda having reached the status that it did without having had that type of assistance, had it not had bases in Afghanistan. So I would say not entirely independent, not always as decentralized, but again, independence of state and centralization versus decentralization matters of degree within this category, rather than something that you could say uniformly characterizes all these groups in the same way. You've got some groups that are not alike at all. Furthermore, if you put Hezbollah into the mix, you've got this is a very different type of organization. So you've got a variety of organizational forms, actually, rather than one particular type. Now, what about the old terrorists? Were they so centralized and hierarchical and chain of command? Well, no, I would say. They were really not so monolithic. Again, looking back at the Germans, the Red Army faction, and the various other movements, Peter Merkel, who's an expert on Germany, who wrote one of the chapters in Terrorism in Context, argues very strongly in that chapter that it's a myth to say that the Red Army faction was monolithic, that there were a number of groups that sort of took that name. They called themselves the Red Army faction, but they were not associated with the original leaders or the original founders of the original group in any way other than to take the name and be inspired by the ideology. And often, indeed, they were very small groups who were not connected with each other, but acting, again, they do something, they say this was the Red Army faction that did this, we all accept it, oh, the Red Army faction is out there and they did it, but in terms of a real organizational cohesion, it simply was not there. I've mentioned the anarchists earlier. Well, nobody would think that anarchists would be particularly well organized. Indeed, I think that they were much better organized than anybody would ever have expected, given their ideology. Some were more organized than others, some to an astounding degree, I think. But by and large, they were not organized. They were free-floating. They moved among borders. There was a lot of inspirational violence. And the anarchists, interestingly enough, were quite happy to include criminality as part of the revolt, because they regarded crime as a part of revolution. Anything that broke the rules was fine with them. So, the association between global organized crime and revolutionary violence was common even in the late 19th century. The Red Brigades in Italy were organized in columns in different Italian cities that often didn't coordinate very well with each other and didn't get along with each other. If you look at Action Directe, the French group that was active in the 80s, there wasn't really one Action Directe. There were different groups at different times, and there was a group that operated in France and a group that operated in Belgium. If you look at some of these other groups and you ask the question of state support, were they really state-sponsored? no, Sendero Luminoso was not state-sponsored. We wouldn't say that the LTTE in Sri Lanka was really state-sponsored. They had some assistance from India in the early years, but not for very long after India intervened in Sri Lanka and the LTTE turned on them. There's ETA, and of course we throw in the mix Libya in all of this. We see again it's not really a very uniform category. There are lots of different forms of organization, and not all the people who belong to these groups really were professional revolutionaries. For example, the Red Cells in Germany really were pickup groups. There were groups in Italy, such as Prima Linea, that really were also, they called them weekend terrorists, because during the week they had another job, they had a profession, and on the weekend they went out and did terrorism, then they went back to their job. So they didn't live in the full-time underground. So again, you have a real mix in this category. We can't really say with certainty that all of these groups, and there's obviously a much larger number of groups in the old category. If you look at seriously active groups from the late 1960s on, groups of some size who've had some consequences in terms of their actions, you'd probably have around 500. So the vast majority of your data out there would be old terrorists. So we do know a good bit more about them, but again, there's a great deal of variability in the ways in which these groups are organized. It might be that indeed that they tended to be better organized. They were certainly longer lived, some of them, than some of the groups that belong to the new terrorism category, and so they, in order to survive, perhaps they had to be better organized. So what I want to sum up by saying is that there are certainly differences among terrorist groups and differences in forms of terrorism, and there are differences over time. And I'm willing to accept, for example, that terrorism has become more lethal, and I'm willing certainly to entertain the idea that it's likely to become more lethal. But I'm not sure that we entirely yet understand why this should be so, why terrorism takes the forms that it does, why groups organize themselves in the way that they do, and why some are more selective than others. We also don't understand completely why groups would resort to terrorism rather than other forms of political violence, or indeed other forms of political activity, because of course we know that terrorism doesn't always occur where groups are excluded from political participation. It's happened in Western liberal democracies. Democracy is not, unfortunately, a panacea for terrorism. So we still need to do more work on answering these questions as to explain the differences among the different types and the different forms. We need to look at the role of technology. We do that some, but we need to bring it more firmly into the equation. We need to look at opportunities. We need to look at capabilities. We probably also need to accept the fact that some terrorism, a lot of terrorism, is always going to be unpredictable to us, because as in any very complex and complicated phenomenon, you're never going to get all the variables pinned down so that you can always know who's going to do what, when and where. But in any case, predictability or unpredictability aside, I don't think we want to throw out what we know. I think that it would be very dangerous to assume that what we know is no longer relevant. I think we can make a judgment as to what's changed and what's not, but by doing that we have to do a careful comparison. I don't think we can assume that the old terrorism, nationalist, limited, even organized, even if we accept everything about the paradigm, I don't think we want to assume that it won't ever change. For example, that a secular group that appeared to fit all the characteristics of the old terrorism, restrained, bargaining, pragmatic, might not shift to being enormously destructive. We don't want to assume that the old terrorism is frozen in time. We don't want to assume that it's been replaced by some new phenomenon, because it's certainly the two, the best we can say is that the two coexist. So we can't assume that it has disappeared or will disappear, and we can't assume that it won't become more destructive or change in some other way. We also can't assume that there won't be further change. We certainly have already seen the reemergence of, well, not even a reemergence, but another flare-up of nationalism. And we've seen the combination between religion and nationalism. So I don't think that we want to focus so exclusively on religion as the driver behind the new terrorism, as to exclude the fact that even secular nationalists, even the most pragmatic, may use extremely destructive terrorism. So, thank you.
Thank you. We'll open it up now for comments and questions. We have microphones on the side. This gentleman in the front row, if speakers could please identify themselves and their institutions. We should also mention, there's going to be a reception following this this session in the adjacent boardroom. And Tanya, I think we're going to start probably 10, 15 minutes early, so you might just let them know there. Yes, sir.
My name is Nigel West. I work for the Centre of Counterintelligence and Security Studies. It seems to me to be far too easy academically to put up a proposition like an Art Sally that is demonstrably untenable and then knock it down.
Mm-hmm.
Surely there are only really two categories, neither of which seem to be addressed in that talk, that have changed, the two phenomena that ought to be considered when you're trying to discriminate between old and new terrorism is firstly the issue of self-preservation. The only thing that has really changed before and after 9/11 is the issue of suicide bombings. Prior to 9/11, Ramzi Yousef and the first attack on the World Trade Center is interesting to study because it wasn't a suicide bombing. And up until 9/11, the one category that you didn't consider was the issue of the tactics adopted by the terrorists. And the second issue that seems to have changed, that is a good way of discriminating between old and new terrorism, is surely the attitude of the United States government. Because prior to 9/11, some terrorists were considered to be welcome guests in the United States, into the Kennedy family, and into the White House and on Larry King Live. Those terrorist groups, of course, or the one in particular, immediately after 9/11, declared that they were different kinds of terrorists. So there you have two really good ways of discriminating between old and new. And the categories that you've described demonstrably are invalid.
Well, the people who support those categories would be interested to hear that. Just a couple of things. Suicide bombings. LTTE, the leader, an old terrorist group. So the practice begins with LTTE and Hezbollah. So it's not unique to the new terrorists, suicide bombing. I mean, certainly one could say that suicide bombings and other suicide attacks are distinctive tactics, but they're not a distinguishing factor between the old and the new in these terms. U.S. policy, I'm not sure which old or new you are referring to, presumably perhaps the IRA, that being a point of dispute. But I'm not sure that U.S. policy has encouraged the new or encouraged the old and not the new, or that the new terrorists are groups that the U.S. opposes and the old not groups that the U.S. opposes. I guess I would see anti-Americanism also as something that's common, could occur in either type, actually. Although, as I've indicated, I'm myself not convinced of the distinction, so I'm not inclined to add more points of distinction between the two. But I'm willing to make that argument.
Yes, on the side.
Louise Shelley, Transnational Crime and Corruption Center, American University. In discussing the anarchists, you mentioned about their involvement in transnational crime activity. How recurrent a problem or pattern do you see this in your analysis of terrorism?
We're thinking of the anarchist movement in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I think it's very interesting ideologically more than anything else, because from the anarchist point of view, anything that challenged the state was good. And it's sort of like, not to be too academic on us, but Eric Hobsbawm's work on primitive rebels, that any kind of banditry is good. Anything that undermines order is good from that point of view. So whether it's criminal, whether it's political, whether it's social, anything that breaks the rules is good from their point of view. I probably exaggerated by saying that it was sort of global organized crime, by way of trying to link it to the present. But they what they really like to do, which I think also has some contemporary relevance is when someone was accused of a crime and put on trial, then the anarchists would take up the cause and they would publicize it and the fact that this person or individual was being persecuted by the state and use it as a propaganda device to support their idea that the state should be overthrown, so that they tried to incorporate crime into revolutionary activity and take credit for it. And then the converse also happened in that people who were guilty or who were accused, often they were found guilty and then they were executed, but leave that aside, once they got to trial, claimed that they were acting out of anarchist or revolutionary motives, that the reason they robbed the bank or murdered their employer was actually because they were an anarchist. And of course that sort of gave anarchism a bad name, but it was a way in which you tried to exculpate yourself by claiming that you were acting for political motives. And of course then you could also drift off into the political offense exception, and they got a lot of sympathy for crimes that otherwise people would have regarded as abhorrent.
Stanley Kober.
Stanley Kober with the Cato Institute. Let me draw on the analogy with the anarchists because I think it's a good one. I've wondered about that myself. What did this decentralized anarchism lead to? The First World War. First World War was triggered by an anarchist act. Now we have a global war on terror triggered by a terrorist act. Is that where we are heading, and how do you bring that to an end? Is that what brings this sort of decentralized terrorism to an end? Because the other contrast that occurs to me, how did the Second World War end? We had suicide bombing, right? The kamikazes. Hirohito ordered it to stop. Who is the modern equivalent of the Hirohito? Who could order it to stop?
Well, I think World War I think it would be fair to say, was sparked more by Serbian nationalists than by the anarchists, although certainly the anarchist violence, Russian revolutionary violence, all contributed to the atmosphere in which political assassinations became almost a routinized method of political opposition, because the anarchists themselves were responsible for the assassination of 8 heads of state in a fairly short period of time. The Russians won. The prototype for the IRA maybe we would count as one. So certainly that would be a link that I would see there. And I guess in terms of just an observation on suicide bombings, where you had bombings that were ordered by, indeed, the chain of command of a military organization, they could be stopped. But where you have suicide bombings practiced by many different groups, there is no central figure who could call them off. You have different groups that can call them off, like the LTTE, call them off when they want to negotiate with the government. Various other groups have dropped them, like the Kurds, like Hezbollah. But there's no central figure. How you would change what has become almost a social or political trend, it's much more difficult. I think it's much more difficult to control, and that you maybe have to look at the way in which trends emerge, become very popular, and then sort of play themselves out, almost in an epidemic or epidemiological type of analysis of what's going on.
Can I just interject a question? And this new versus old. The series has provided an array of different speakers and different approaches and some concepts and methods, but it seems, it strikes us that analytically and in policy terms, Washington and the broader kind of community is not dealing very well with what the administration calls the nexus issue: proliferation and terrorism, state and non-state. And part of the new terrorism paradigm, as you mentioned, is this sort of that the nexus exists between the two functional issues, proliferation, terrorism, and between the actors, state, non-state. If one accepts your kind of lay down on the issue, which was really interesting, what is that? Which really invites us to sort of to turn it around and look at it in this traditional context rather than as something qualitatively new. How does that then affect the downstream strategies for dealing with the terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda, where people have sort of thrown up hands and there's been an effort to try to get some type of traction on the issue, and it's been tough. I mean, you may not have thought that through, but I just invite any comment that you might have on that.
Well, of course, you're right. It's a very complicated question, and obviously extremely important, because this is something like this is going to be with us for a while, and we really don't know what kind of direction it's going to go in. And what we see is patterns now of pretty rapid change and fluctuation. In terms of types of actors, I guess I see actually within the sort of now Al-Qaeda movement, which in movement is not even the right word, penumbra might be the word we would want, different types of organizations and different types of strategies. And I think that one of the dangers is that we will simply say, oh, all this is Al-Qaeda something, and not see that, well, the Salafist groups in Algeria are different from the Salafist groups in Morocco, are different from the ones that are formed in a diaspora here. We have different types of actors rather than just one type of actor out there, and that we make this distinction. We say, okay, they're state actors, they're non-state actors. There are many different types of states, and there are many different types of non-states. And so we want to sort of create this lump together category that makes it easier for us to talk about it. And I think we need to differentiate within that. And that it's only by differentiating in this way that you might begin to get the clue of where you would find a group that was both willing and able to try to acquire methods that we would like to keep out of their hands. And I also think that it would be dangerous to assume that that there's no state support, as I mentioned earlier. I mean, we sort of got locked into this state-sponsored, and I know that Daniel Byman has a book coming out about state sponsorship, quote unquote, and he points out that it can take a variety of forms, passive, active, different levels. And as I think I tried to indicate with regard particularly to the early years of Al-Qaeda, it really did not proceed independently of states. It's a very complex relationship there, and so we should keep that in mind as well. We can't say, okay, here are the groups and the state will just go out and use them and give them these weapons. Here are groups that will proceed totally independently. It's just unfortunately a much more messy situation. But I really think that Al-Qaeda is so far from being a single actor that if you don't differentiate among, as I say, I don't even quite anymore know what to call them, components, affiliates, spin-offs, imitators, all in this, the French have called it a nebula. You know, they write books called La Nébuleuse that's about Al-Qaeda, and it's sort of like a galaxy. And that's not very easy to deal with either. None of those metaphors are good. But I just see it as an enormously complicated phenomenon. And that unless you realize that, you're not going to be able to predict where it's going to go, even if you could predict it all.
Thank you. And the gentleman in the back with the glasses. You, sir? Yes.
Ira Strauss, Committee on Eastern Europe and Russia and NATO. I have two questions. One is sort of a methodological one, coming back to the first question. It was wonderful to hear all the distinctions and precise clarifications, and yet I always wonder when this happens, is it clarification or some element of obscurantism? And what I would like to see is when we say that there are perhaps a difference of quantity, not of quality. Of course, qualities change when quantities change, sometimes at least. And one should always expect there to be some continuity, but that doesn't... The fact that there is not an absolute continuity means we've clarified things, but not that we've eliminated the distinctions, rather than we've clarified the distinctions. So I think perhaps slightly different wording of this could leave a better feeling of clarification rather than of obscuring the distinction, which nevertheless may be just as real after clarification. Now, my question comes to some historical aspects that you brought up with this. I think you're right in tracing terrorism to the anarchist movements, as well as earlier roots, but that was one of the major ones of modern terrorism. The strange thing about the anarchist movement, especially the Russian one, was not just that it was somewhat organized, but that a substantial part of it fed into the KGB and began enforcing terror from the standpoint of the state, something that scholars of Russian terrorism like Paul Avrich were quite shocked by when they found out about it. They started idealizing these people, then realized, well, there's some problems here. And I think this helps explain some of the evolution that may be obscured by these distinctions. It started out apocalyptic in ideology. Quite right, all these movements have elements of apocalyptic ideology. But targeted on individuals, full of moral discussion of what is ethical to do and what not, and very self-restraining in this regard. Then when it got taken over by state terror and became a part of that, the state was released from those restraints. But the millenarian aspects were carried by the Soviet state, which was something much less nihilistic. It was a positive construct, even if a very horrible one, in fact. And in the Cold War, both sides had their terrorists, but the aim of a better world was held by the mainstay of states in the world, real entities, not by just destruction and blowing things up. And destruction and blowing things up actually increased, but gradually, secularly, over a long time in the course of this. At the end of the Cold War, some of these forces were released from the state constructs that sustained their millenarian aspects. Their own millenarianism came into full play, it seems. And here it seems to me one can see in these several stages how one gets from an earlier terrorism to a new one in which these elements, which have always been there, take on a qualitatively much, much greater significance if one adds to that technologies as well. It seems to me that the qualitative distinction perhaps is very real. One simply clarifies the links between old and new rather than eliminating any distinction.
Well, I think that's interesting, and I think you hit at one of the key problems, which is where's the continuity and what changes, and particularly why do things change? And that's sort of interesting, the way in which you would say that non-state actors become states, become non-states, and this results in some of the changes. I'm not sure you and I would be thinking about the same groups, whether I would consider the groups that you seem to be thinking of anarchists in the Russian context, but you did make me think of the fact that the first generation, some of you will know, of Russian terrorists were regarded themselves as being extremely discriminating, extremely selective, extremely moral, extremely careful. And the next generation, we now tend to lump them all together, were regarded, for example, by Albert Camus as being extremely unselective, knowing no limits. He wrote a whole play about the fact that they knew no limits. And we look back and say, oh, they were all very discriminating. But when we look at their own perceptions of their behavior, and of course another irony in the story you're alluding to is, of course, that one reason for the Soviet state to become quickly so repressive is that they claimed they were threatened by the terrorists, and they of course turned on some of the terrorists, such as the socialist revolutionaries, assassinated the leader of the group who had been lured back to Russia. So at the same time that they're adopting some of their apocalyptic and millenarian ideas, as well as the notion that terrorism can be virtuous, they also turned on them as well. So,
the gentleman in here.
Thank you. Hello, my name is Mark David Block, State Department. You've written on the subject of how terrorism ends. And I'm wondering, as you looked at the various groups that you did in preparing for today, what distinctions, if any, between old or new there might be, or is it just too early to tell about new?
Oh, that's a really very interesting question, and I really had not thought deeply about that, but I'm afraid that my answer won't be very satisfactory, because some of the new ones, like if we put Hezbollah in the new category, Hezbollah has certainly changed, particularly in terms of targeting the United States, and indeed of a lot of it, of the level and form of its anti-Israeli activity as well. And you have the Egyptian Islamist group that gives up violence. You have the Muslim Brotherhood giving up violence. So if we consider them to be in the new category, there are some that have given up. And certainly there are some in the old category who have as well. So I can't say that the new terrorists never give up and fight to the death, and the old terrorists were willing to give up because they were pragmatic and saw that the game was up, or that they had gotten as much of what they wanted. Of course, as we know, what often happens is that there's factionalism within movements, and one branch is willing to compromise and is fairly pragmatic, and another branch is not. And another aspect of this that I think is related to that question is that I didn't really talk about and should be fitted into this type of analysis would be groups like Hezbollah or Hamas that have, in effect, party-type wings, and groups that don't. And that may be more promising as an explanation. I've argued on some occasions that groups that have, that for which terrorism is not an identity but one tactic among others, might be more willing to give it up, but I can't really sustain that empirically. But that is a thought that I really had not applied to this and that I could ask as well.
Gentleman there.
I found your distinction very interesting, actually. Something
identify
to think
yourself,
about.
please.
Yeah, my name is Ali Liami, Center for Democracy and Human Rights in Saudi Arabia, here in Washington, D.C. I like your distinction. It sounds like terrorism is going to be with us, according to your scenario here, regardless what happens. Is it safe to say that all terrorism is more nationalistic liberation movements, and new ones is more ideological, but more than just nationalistic, getting rid of colonialism and occupation and that kind of thing. But the goal is the same, to control. The old terrorists want to control. The new one, the old terrorism want to control partially, maybe, or share with others. The new ones want to take all over. Is that safe assessment of this?
Well, except that some revolutionary movements that presumably would be in the old terrorism category also really wanted to take over and fundamentally transform their own society and sometimes neighboring societies as well. So sort of the transformative quality. We might argue that the scope of the ambitions of the new terrorists is almost more social than political. And it's sort of to change history on a wide scale, whereas the old terrorists, again, we don't have to accept the distinction, which is what I was saying, are simply their ambitions are to change one particular state to another form. And sometimes terrorism is used for ends that are not even very revolutionary. The change they want to bring about is reasonably moderate, in effect. Their aims, the methods seem more extreme than the aims. For example, if you look precisely at the first generation of Russian terrorists, they wanted a constitutional monarchy. They weren't even really, they were revolutionaries, but the state they wanted would not have been a revolutionary state. So there's a great deal of variability. So it could be the level of transformation that the group aspires to that makes the difference.
One last question in the back there. Yes.
Bassam Haddad, Department of Government, Georgetown University. I have a question that is quite easy to brush off, but perhaps difficult to answer. And it's basically, to what extent do you think that the entire discourse on terrorism, or the industry of the discourse on terrorism, is influenced by the establishment, media, academia, and government in the United States, and perhaps some of its allies? And I ask this because we've been traveling through various continents and different countries, and what you hear in different parts of the world, including in Europe, with the exception perhaps of the UK, is an entirely different discourse that focuses on different kinds of trajectories, different kinds of histories, different kinds of actors. And I'm asking this is because I'm assuming that the intention of the distinction between the new and the old terrorism is to be able to diagnose things better, to find some sort of solution, resolution. And to what extent can we do this sitting here in the capital of the United States, which in many parts of the world is seen as a sponsor, supporter, or an ally of states or actors, or formerly or today, that are quite problematic given these definitions of terrorism?
We're sort of coming full circle because, as I recall, our first question also referred to U.S. policy as one of the distinguishing factors between the old and the new. There's actually a lot to be said about that, and it is a very hard question to answer. One thing would be to say that the study of terrorism has always been very event-driven, and therefore in the United States it's been very driven by threats to the United States. But this is true of almost everything we study. It seems it's inevitable. If we're political scientists or even historians or sociologists or other social scientists, we can resolutely refuse to be topical, or we can be engaged with the issues of the day, so we're almost by force engaged with them. It's also true that there are other mundane factors, the fact that a lot of funding comes from the government, the fact that the media often takes its cue from the government as to what is news. We take our cues then from the media. We study them, but we take our cues from them as well. And that in different contexts, you probably are going to have a different discourse about terrorism. One of the things I work on is why the U.S. is targeted. And when I talk about that, I try to point out the fact that if you look at all the active groups over time, again, not over all time, let us say from the late 1960s on, 500 plus groups, maybe 50 have targeted the United States. But our attention has always been focused primarily on those 50, on our FTO list, on the ones who target the United States. And we simply have often neglected other groups who are using the same forms of violence that if we just looked at them, we would undoubtedly say that's terrorism too. But because they were on our side or because they were beneath our radar screen, they didn't fit into this universe that we studied. And I think most of us who are serious and objective researchers try always to bring them in and to cast the net more broadly. But we always risk being caught up in this particular worldview that groups that are against the United States are the terrorists on whom we want to focus and those who pose the gravest threat, and the others are somehow not as important or they're not terrorists. And I too have been in many other countries where they usually argue with me about why their favorite terrorist threat is not on our FTO list. And when is it going to get on the FTO list? And I can't explain who gets on and who gets off the FTO list. So there is a very different worldview. But of course, since we're all academics, we also go around studying that discourse. And it gives us a lot to study, too. I'm not a discourse analyst myself, but there are people who study the discourse on terrorism as well as terrorism. So we're all studying ourselves, studying ourselves, studying ourselves. It's like the media who seem to interview themselves. With all due respect to all of you journalists, when I turn on the television, they're often interviewing another journalist about journalism.
Bruce?
Well, I don't think it'll surprise you that I'm still unconvinced that one can't make this profound demarcation between the old and the new terrorism. But that said, I think you've left us with an extremely thoughtful and clear and a very elegant exegesis of this issue. And I can't think of a better challenge. I mean, you certainly achieved what the best of terrorism research and analysis seeks to do, which is to test hypotheses, to probe the thinking and understanding and rationalization of why terrorists do what they do, and you've done it in a remarkably clear manner. So thank you very, very much.
Thanks.
Please join us for the reception in the boardroom.
No, there are a few others here. I was wondering.
I spoke at the Institute for Policy Studies and at the United Services Institute.
Yes, sir.
in many ways. Terrorism is an instrument of war. Or war is an instrument of terrorism. Two countries go to war.
Psychological warfare, deterrence.
Two countries go to war. They are using every means of terrorism against each other.
Classics, continuation of politics.
WMD comes in. So the biggest possessor of WMD is the biggest terrorist.
Yes. Well, and attacking strategic bombing could be considered a form of terrorism.
That is given a bit of respectability, that instrument. But from the point of view of sufferer, he is going to go.
Equally dead, whether it's from the air or the ground. Yep. Nice to meet
Thank you.
But as I was saying, since I studied it seems quite apparent that a lot of things that are complicated. The world is a much more complex place. We have far more regional, if not local, conflicts that have galvanized enough attention of people and groups that they take it upon themselves to undertake some missions where there is some political backing, where there is a lack of leadership. And so there are many places on the planet where that is the
Privatization, violence. It's
right.
so easy.
Then you have, as we rightly indicated, we discussed, our discussion of what concerns us, which is, a fraction of what is concerning the globe.
Yeah.
Then we have our own complicated matrix of involvement with the world, because now we no longer, it's no longer a world that's simply exporting and importing trade balance arguments, although that's still going on as well. Now we have private enterprises that have reached out, complicated this now. Actually, now we have private enterprise complicating our endeavors overseas, because now we have private contractors performing security work. And, in a State Department, we have these issues. Now these people are being taken hostage, which is seen as a terrorist act. And yet, these people look at our involvement over there because they say, well, you guys are providing services for the machine that occupies our country. And of course, the two different views, our view in the United States, we see somebody who's there begging for his life. You may be Japanese, you may be American, you may be Italian, you may be British or she. And of course, now the whole analysis becomes so much more matrix.
There's so many different kinds of actors.
Right. It's no longer quite, who is who? The question is, as the gentleman just pointed out, who is the terrorist?
I'll end up in there, but I'm interested in following up on the subject of how terrorism ends.
Oh, okay, really.
Yeah,
that was.
Can I have your email?
Sure, and you were quite right. I hadn't really thought about that when I was working through this. It's really very simple. It's just in Crenshaw at Westwood, Washington. She's first initial of the name, and also if you do a Google search, you can find me.
You're a state.
You find Wesleyan. This is my former.
You're a state.
Hi, yes, hi.
I live in Holland.
Hi.
I'm also a state.
I'm in SCT.
Oh, okay, I'm over in A Bureau.
I think that my colleague Phil Pomper's son was working in the legal office in counterterrorism. Steve Pomper.
What's his name? Steve
Steve Pomper.
Pomper?
Okay, I used to know a lot of people in your office. Yeah, hi. Oh.
You ever? You're not in this